As the Greek government discovered, when a country runs out of money to pay policemen and teachers and the army, it descends into chaos. The Greek economy is tiny compared to ours, and yet the EU struggled to save it. If the UK fails, what then?
The absolute nightmare scenario is that the government prints its way out of the problem. It just prints money like crazy.
And governments do it when they're in an awful lot of debt.
It's the worst thing you could do.
As the debt gets to be bigger and bigger, it becomes more than a temptation, it becomes a necessity. The governments get in a position where they can't do anything but inflate the currency.
More money is usually good when the money is worth something. Right? The more you print it, the less it's worth, and that's a problem for people.
British governments have been steadily debasing the currency, or printing money, for decades through the deliberate expansion of credit. Here is the money supply going up, and here is the spending power of sterling going down. When you go into a shop and everything seems more expensive, it's because the currency in your pocket is worth less and less. It was this easy credit policy that led to the recent financial crisis, because it rewards borrowing and punishes saving.
So if you're a saver, you're putting money aside in the bank in order to pay for your retirement. When your retirement comes, you find it's worth an awful lot less than you originally thought. Who's had the benefit of that? Not the bank, no, the government.
If money is losing its value, it's not a very good idea to save it. What you want to do is get out of it. So typically, in this period since 1971, it's been crazy to save money.
Now they're printing money even faster. They call it quantitative easing, and it's the ultimate stealth tax. If you'd put £100 in the bank last year, in effect it's now only worth £95. Many regard printing money as plain fraud.
People are cheated and defrauded by this.
So effectively they're stealing from people by printing money?
Oh, inflation is theft. There's no question about it at all.
You get a dollar printed up by the government right out off of the mint, and you look at it and you think, well, that's as good as any other dollar. But if it's an extra dollar, a dollar added to the money supply, it's counterfeit. There are no extra resources behind it.
Printing money is also a very dangerous thing to do.
I know it's hard for people to imagine, but in Germany, people used to go around with wheelbarrows full of money because the money wasn't worth actually the paper it was printed on.
Not many of us can remember back to the problems in the Weimar Republic and Austria in the 1920s. But there's a book about that called When Money Dies. The title's very good. And when money dies like that as a result of inflation, the whole economic structure dies.
Britain faces economic ruin. It is possible to escape the current crisis, but to do so, we must understand how we got into it. For years, politicians have been spending money they didn't have and saddling future generations with gigantic debts. Why do they do it?
Hello, everybody.
Well, part of the problem is it's very much in the interest of politicians to spend money.
What are you doing, Mr. Punch? I'm standing for election. Vote for me. Vote for me. Why should we vote for you? We think you're rubbish. That's not the way to win an election. I'm very sorry. I should think you are sorry.
To win votes, politicians often make grand promises. Promises that involve spending money.
I can have a brand new contemporary art gallery. Hold on, Mr. Punch. Where is all this money coming from? Oh dear.
Politicians want to be popular, so they buy the support of different groups by spending money. A dollop here, a dollop there. But the money they're spending isn't theirs. They're being generous with your money.
The politicians keep talking about what they're going to spend, as though it's their money. They haven't got any of their own money. They've got our money.
The government doesn't have any money of its own. All the money the government has is money that it has taken, either in the form of borrowing or more probably taxation, from other people. So elections have been described as bribing the voters with their own money.
It's not their money. If it was their money, they wouldn't spend it like that at all. They wouldn't be half as profligate.
At first, this money came from tax, but politicians found they couldn't raise enough from taxes and decided to borrow money. In effect, they were taxing future generations.
Hey, did somebody call for me?
Yes. Can I have some money?
How much would you like?
4.8 trillion pounds.
4.8 trillion pounds? And how are you going to pay that back?
I know.
Who is?
The little baby.
The little baby? Oh dear, what have you done with my little baby? Mr. Punch is using it to borrow money. Naughty Mr. Punch.
Oh, dear, dear, dear.
Over the past 100 years, as governments have taxed more and spent more, the state has grown bigger and bigger. The two world wars saw huge increases in government spending, and after each war, the state failed to shrink back to its former size. Today, we have reached a point where the public sector in Britain is bigger than the private sector. The expanded state sector is paid for out of taxes. The trouble is, to raise more tax, the government needs more people in jobs that actually pay tax.
Now you might ask, if we need more people with jobs, why doesn't the government just go out and hire loads more social workers and lollipop ladies and local government liaison officers? Sadly, that won't help. In fact, it'll push us even further into debt. That's because, for the most part, public sector workers don't create wealth, they consume it. It's the private sector that creates wealth, which the government then taxes. Private sector workers are tax producers. Public sector workers are paid for out of these taxes. They are tax consumers. Having too many tax consumers and not enough tax producers is precisely what has caused Britain to decline and caused this horrendous debt crisis. Not enough coming in, too much going out.
The public sector job has to be paid for by the public and out of tax revenue or borrowing money. And it isn't the same way as creating a genuine wealth-creating job.
Lollipop ladies are good, but actually they don't create any wealth. Social workers are good, they don't create any wealth. Firemen are good, but they don't create any wealth. At the end of it all, we actually need to manufacture something.
Taking money out of the private sector where wealth is created in order to divert it to the public sector where wealth is consumed is a very, very bad idea.
So to pay for more public sector workers, tax must be imposed on wealth-creating private sector workers. The trouble is, this raises the cost of labour.
As any well-to-do middle-class type will tell you, when they hire a nanny or a cleaner, they'd much rather not pay their tax. Why? Because it makes them more expensive to hire. From an employer's perspective, income tax is, in effect, a tax on labour. And just as a tax on cigarettes makes cigarettes more expensive, and a tax on alcohol makes alcohol more expensive, so a tax on labour does exactly the same.
Taxes discourage demand for whatever is being taxed. So if you've got very large taxes on labour, on wages, national insurance and so on, that would discourage the demand for labour. And that's a key reason why jobs are not being created in large enough numbers in the UK in the private sector.
You have to remember that when the government creates a job by taxing more, it's destroying jobs elsewhere by the act of taxation.
If there's another country, perhaps on the other side of the world, where they don't have such high taxes, that gives companies in that country a substantial advantage. They can actually turn around products more cheaply, more businesses become profitable, and the British businesses, which have these crushing burdens upon them, actually just become unsustainable, see their profits drop, or even go out of business altogether.
For every job that you create in the public sector, you destroy at least one job in the private sector.
The expanding state has changed the shape of Britain. Back in the 1960s, we had 8 million people working in manufacturing, and we had 3.5 million people working in the public sector. Today, the number of people working directly for government has risen to about 5.5 million. And when we add other people on the public payroll, like GPs, the figure rises to almost 7.5 million. The number of people working in manufacturing, meanwhile, has shrunk to less than 3 million. We are sometimes told that the loss of manufacturing jobs has been compensated by more service sector jobs, people like hairdressers, window cleaners and estate agents. But there is a problem with service sector jobs. Many of the things we want to buy are manufactured outside Britain. To pay for them, we need to sell things abroad, and most service sector jobs don't travel.
Well, the problem is it's very hard to export services. You can't very well shine somebody's shoes or do somebody's laundry unless they live near you. So typically you export product.
What's more, many of the new service sector workers are in regions which are largely supported by public money. They are what economists call secondary tax consumers.
You've got hundreds of thousands of jobs at the moment in Britain that derive all their revenues really from the public sector. They are hidden public sector jobs, which means the real size of the state sector when it comes to employment is even larger than we think at the moment.
Politicians sometimes say we shouldn't worry about a big public sector because public spending stimulates economic growth. Let's see if it's true. The trouble is, as we have seen, the government's only source of money is us. The taxman is visiting Roger the restaurant owner and taxing him £50. The £50 comes directly out of Roger's profits. Roger's £50 is then given in wages to a government employee. As it happens, this public servant feels like treating himself to a lavish French meal and graciously decides to patronise Roger's establishment. The bill comes to £50, which, given the cost of fish and foie gras these days, our public servant considers very reasonable. The government has returned every penny of Roger's tax to him in new business. But how stimulating does he find this? Roger's business is not more profitable, but less. In the end, he'll have no more money in the till than when he started, but now he's had to pay for extra food and wine and the chef's time. Government spending has left him not richer, but poorer.
The government's always talking about putting more money into the economy, stimulating the economy with more money. But where does that money come from? The answer is that it comes from the rest of us.
All of the government's money has to come from the private sector. That's what generates wealth. That's the only thing that there is to tax. There isn't any sort of magic pot of gold in the back garden at number 10 Downing Street.
I decided to run this past some of Britain's most powerful and enthusiastic supporters of state spending, starting with the head of the TUC, Brendan Barber.
But you're taking money out of the productive economy, and then you say you spend a little money of that money back in the productive economy. How is that stimulating?
Well, if we'd not seen the extra spending from government in the face of recession, I think the recession would have been very much worse. We'd have seen unemployment go higher.
But the extra spending comes from the productive economy, doesn't it?
Well, of course.
The construction industry in this country would be on its knees if it wasn't for public sector works at the moment, because there's precious little private sector investment.
But aren't they just secondary tax consumers? I mean, I think the point that people find confusing is that governments talk as if they've got an independent source of money, when in fact it's our money. What you're saying is you can better spend our money than we can.
The only source of money that the public sector has is basically through taxes, one way or another.
The government doesn't have its own money, does it?
No, of course. I mean, the government is responsible for managing the public finances, and those public finances come from tax revenues.
Let's take another example. The government decides to build a shiny new office building and another 90,000 road humps. To do this, they employ private firms. The trouble is, the money to pay for it, and more, comes from tax levied on other sections of the productive economy.
The idea that the government of the day actually creates growth, creates prosperity, is the reverse of the truth.
You can clearly point at something the government's done. We've given you this job, or we've built that building. But if you're taking that money, I would say, out of the economy, out of the private economy, because you're taxing people's income or taxing products or taxing corporations, that's money that those individuals, that those shopkeepers, that those corporations don't have to build their own buildings.
Trying to stimulate the productive economy with public spending, paid for with money taken out of the productive economy, is like treating a patient by extracting blood out of one arm, spilling a great deal of it, and then injecting what's left into the other arm. The idea that public spending will stimulate growth is the biggest myth of the 20th century, and it's the cause of Britain's economic decline. The The burden of paying for the public sector rests entirely on the